Hi! Thanks so much for joining us again this week for Latino Political News Roundup. I'm Sara Inés Calderón.
And I'm Adriana Maestas.
And this week we have some more Latino political news. I think the top of the list this week was the debate.
Yeah, the vice presidential debate.
The vice presidential debate.
In Kentucky.
In Kentucky. If you weren't following us on Twitter, we were both tweeting about it, and I'll go ahead and put our Twitter names here on the screen so you can go ahead and subscribe to us, but or follow us on Twitter. But so what did you think about the debate? And what did you think about that?
I mean, it was like Joe Biden pretty much ran over Paul Ryan.
Pretty much.
Yeah, but there was also some criticism where people were saying that Joe Biden kind of came across rude.
Yeah, I think they were both kind of rude to each other.
Yeah, they were.
And I think that there was a little bit of, and to me personally, I thought it was very foreign policy heavy, which I think is strange considering it's going to be the only vice presidential debate, and that most of what a vice presidential candidate or vice president,
well, for
does
me,
is domestic.
I'm not so really shocked by that, because you also look at Joe Biden has a lot of foreign policy experience, and they were talking about him, supposedly Biden's dream job would be to be Secretary of State, and I think that's drawing upon the experience he had as a senator and all of the sort of foreign policy stuff he did in the Senate.
Interesting.
So
yeah,
I'm not too surprised, and it's also an opportunity, I think, that Paul Ryan was trying to correct some of the statements that Romney has been making in the foreign policy world. So
that's an interesting point. There was practically no mention of education. There was some discussion of the economy, but there wasn't anything about immigration.
No, not
which
again.
Which is interesting because of this ad that came out, right?
Oh, yeah.
So you want to say the Obama had
the
a
Obama ad,
right?
Yeah. So this week, the Obama campaign released an ad, and it's pretty clever because President Obama is speaking Spanish, and he does have a pretty good accent in Spanish.
It was pretty good.
Yeah,
I would say it was pretty good.
The way he pronounces his words is pretty. It's not, it doesn't sound too foreign. You can tell that, of course, President Obama doesn't speak Spanish, but he does a pretty good job at trying to pronounce words properly.
Definitely.
So he invokes the Dreamers in the ad, and this ad is airing in 5 states, key swing states: Colorado, Florida, Nevada, Ohio, and Virginia. And basically he's talking about how the Dreamers inspire him, and how it, as a parent, he looks to them as sort of doing the things that he wants his girls to do, like caring about their country, being
interesting,
studying, being
achievement
achievement-oriented.
Wow. So he transformed the Dreamers into the model American in this ad?
That's kind of... Yeah, that's kind of what he's doing. But it's also an instance where we're seeing, the president is obviously, he's trying to build upon the Deferred Action Program. In some ways you could say that the Dreamers kind of gave him a big headache. They were...
Yeah, you could definitely say
yeah.
that.
And to their credit, it was the work of what the Dreamers did, the protesting, the sitting in the offices that really, prompted the president to action. So
yeah. Interesting. Well, but there was another debate, which I neglected to mention earlier, between the two senatorial candidates in Arizona this week, Jeff Flake, Richard Carmona. From what we read, there really wasn't a whole lot of movement either way given the debate. Nobody really won. There wasn't any big takeaway from the debate. One thing that is interesting was there's a duel of political ads that centered around women in Arizona between these two candidates, but then it doesn't really seem like anyone's winning or losing, because if you think about it, there's 2 polls out that show, one shows Carmona ahead and one shows Flake ahead. So
yeah, it seems like they're still really tight. Not a lot of movement.
It's going to be really interesting to see what happens. But basically the dueling ads, as you were saying, is...
very interesting thing. So Flake campaign has this ad where they're attacking Dr. Carmona, and it has this woman who apparently worked with him or supervised him. And it's basically what she's doing is she's highlighting some sort of a personal spat that they had. So
Yeah, it was very melodramatic. I would call it the telenovela of political ads because I felt scared. It's just like watching it,
she's
so
kind
melodramatic.
of in this, she has this sort of ominous, a little bit scary voice where she's talking about supposedly Dr. Carmona came to her house at night and knocked on her door and frightened her.
Yeah.
So,
and we'll put the video, both of these videos in the description if you want to watch them. But yeah, and then the Carmona campaign responded with
their own ad.
Their own ad
with a woman colleague that he worked with who basically, is saying how Dr. Carmona is great to work with, and she's talking him up in all the positive things.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is sort of like we're seeing personal kind of mudslinging going on in this race, and
it's really interesting this is happening. I guess that's what happens in the last few weeks of a campaign, but I think it's interesting that it's like centering on like women issues. I mean, are women like a really big constituency in Arizona? I mean, is that going to be like a special constituency that's going to kind of push one of these guys over the top? I mean, or is it just kind of like that's where they could find the dirt? I mean, it's interesting.
Well, I mean, nationally we see the focus on women, right?
That's
like women's issues. So I guess, Arizona would just be a little microcosm of that. But I do think it was an interesting ad. So we'll have that down there so you guys can comment on it and let us know what you think.
Yeah. So there's going to be another presidential debate this week. Again, you have to follow us on Twitter for all the good stuff.
We're always tweeting the debates.
We're always tweeting the debates. So the debate this week is going to be really exciting because we're going to say, is the President Obama, is he going to bounce back from his last lackluster debate performance?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's sort of, I think, what everybody's looking for is like, will he come out of the gates kind of like Biden did this week where, Vice President Biden was obviously more aggressive and he was ready to go for the kill.
Yeah,
so.
He totally did. And Paul Ryan was drinking water. Everybody was talking about all the funny things Paul Ryan was drinking water for. I thought that was funny. But so follow us on Twitter. Again, I'll put the annotation so you can see what our handles are. So I think one thing that I'm really interested to see in this debate is the follow-up to this Dreamer ad. Is that going to be an issue? Is immigration going to come up? Because I think that's one area in which Obama can just pummel Romney if we're going to be talking about, Latino voters or Latino issues, especially considering he just put out this ad. I think the other thing that's going to be really interesting is there's an affirmative action case before the Supreme Court right now that it'll be interesting to see whether or not that comes out in the debate. It probably won't.
I don't think so. I think it's too much of a
current event or
well, no. I mean, it's something like I think it's an issue where for President Obama, I mean, to kind of like bring up affirmative action. I mean, like you notice he hasn't really, as president, he hasn't really brought up race issues, and he tries to avoid it.
That's
I think
true.
Because people will try to say
because everybody else is bringing it up all the time.
Well, no, I think like he walks a real fine line, and so I'm not so sure that he's gonna. I think if there's a question about it, I mean, obviously they're gonna have to answer, but I don't think like anybody would venture to go there.
Well, that's unfortunate. I mean, if you haven't been following this case, it's pretty important because the University of Texas is affirmative action policy is kind of what's at stake here. And the thing that's sad about it is, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a public interest lawyer who was basically saying this is a terrible public interest case because the woman in question, Abigail Fisher, is not the ideal candidate to make the argument that it was because of the University of Texas's affirmative action policy that she didn't get in. In Texas, if you're in the top 10% of your class, you gain automatic admission. She was in the top 12%.
Top 12%, and her SAT was, I think, below the average for the typical UT student, right?
She was 82 in a class of 674. We both worked that out. That's 12%.
Yeah, she was in the top 12%.
She had a 3.59 grade point average on a scale of 4.0. And, what was that?
Well, just basically.
Oh, and her SAT scores were like 1180 or something. It wasn't even 1200.
Yeah, and they were saying what the average UT student is at least 1200.
Yeah,
and combined on verbal and math.
Yeah, and not to make light of this or anything, but what I put on Facebook was like, I'm a Mexican, like Hispanics like score lower than these things. Hispanics are like historically like underperforming education. I had better scores than her. guess what? I got into UT Austin because I was in the top 10% of my class, not because I was Hispanic, you know? So I think that it's unfortunate.
Well, I mean, like, you would think that, you know, if they were going to bring a case like this, you would have a student who had, like, 3.9 grade point average.
1,500 SAT score.
Exactly. You know, somebody who is, you know, a national merit scholar.
Exactly.
Somebody like that who was rejected from the University of Texas.
Exactly.
I mean, then I think, you know,
you might have, you know,
a more compelling case.
Exactly. And unfortunately, it appears as though, you know, oral arguments in this case have really not done, you know, affirmative action policies any favors. And so, according to some of the stories that we're going to have in the description for y'all, it seems that, that the court is considering whether to simply overturn UT's approach as unconstitutional or reshape the broader, you know, idea of affirmative action in higher education. So this is a pretty big deal. We'll probably be hearing about it.
Well, it's also a big deal for definitely Latino students because, you know, a lot of times they're not coming from the best high schools.
Exactly.
And, you know, even though we're the largest group in college now, you know, like we're still quite a ways behind.
Exactly. So we'll see that. And then there was another thing that happened this week. I mean, just talking really quickly about voter ID. South Carolina's voter ID law was basically like put on hold. The federal court on Wednesday blocked the state from enforcing its new photo ID law next month because there's not enough time. But they said it could be implemented next year. So the voter ID thing is far from over. We will be hearing about it again. So,
and that's the thing is like when a lot of states were implementing these laws, the argument against it is like there's just not a lot of time. I mean, so even if you are, it's easy for you to get the ID. I mean, assuming, you know, you could take time off of work.
Yes,
you
stand in line at the
DMV. Stand in line or do what, or pay the fee, you know, whatever it is to go get your new picture ID. A lot of times the states, what the assumption was that many states didn't have the infrastructure to do this.
Yeah.
So even if you wanted to go get that ID, it's entirely possible that, you know, the states didn't have the bandwidth to get it done.
Which I guess is what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of like, you know, the voter ID issue is definitely like kind of these become kind of like a culture war, you know, that we've seen in American electoral politics, especially as it pertains to Latinos, right? But there's another Latino culture war going on in Texas right now. In one of the stories,
the Congressional campaign,
in one of the campaigns we talked about last week, which is between Quico Canseco and Pete Gallego in Texas' 23rd
very
district.
Interesting.
So, I mean, you had some really interesting thoughts on.
Well, it's okay. So basically, Congressman Canseco had sent out a mailer. His campaign did, and do you want to talk about the mailer?
Yeah, basically, the mailer is tugging at the, you know, conservative religious values of Latino voters in this district. It was sent out by Canseco's campaign, criticizing Gallego. It had an awful photo of Gallego, right? I mean, he just looked sinister, or it was strange. It was a strange photo. And then they had these sinister-looking photos of, like, Nancy Pelosi.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine who said, you know, it's just kind of underestimates the voters in this district. And, you know, I have family that lives in this district, so I agree. I think it's a kind of underestimation of, you know, the intellect or the prowess of these voters. But essentially, you know, there's three kind of like captions, and we'll show it here. The one says, you know, that Gallego said no to God, that he wants to provide abortions for underage girls, that he wants to legalize marriage between man and man, whatever that means.
Yeah,
so I mean,
like quite a homophobic quip right there.
Yeah, but I mean, even just reading the mailer in and of itself, it kind of discredits itself because all of these claims about what Gallego's positions are coming from like third and fourth parties of, you know, that the Democratic platform, you know, said something and then he, you know, transformed that into say no to God. And that some other group that endorsed Gallego, you know, wants to do abortions, and that means that a Gallego wants to, you know, abort all little children's fetuses. I don't even understand how, you know, that's an issue. Like, when did underage girls getting abortions become a huge political issue in South Texas? Finally, you know, this legalized marriage between man and man. I mean, I don't find Latinos to be particularly homophobic. I mean, we were talking about this earlier.
And also, too, I think there was some recent polling around this where it showed, and we can look this up for you, that I think that, if anything, Latinos were a little bit more accepting of gay marriage.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, because I think that we see these things as, well, okay, I have gay family members, and, we're big on family, and we don't like to see them being excluded from things. Yeah, exactly. Ostracized and excluded from, everyday activity.
Yeah. So, I mean, what do you think about this, though, that here's a, this is what's cool about this. We told you last week that, this race is between two Latino candidates, right? And so you'd assume they're coming from the same cultural context. But here this guy's, like, trying to, create this, like, war, this culture war, like you said, amongst, this similar constituencies. I mean, I don't know.
Well, I mean, like, I think because Congressman Canseco is a Republican, the Republicans sometimes like to pull out the traditional values, their traditional values card, and and lay it down on the table.
Yeah, I guess that's what he's doing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's a tactic, and it probably appeals to, certain Texas voters who might be more religious or a little bit more conservative in that regard. Yeah. So, I'm sure he knows what he's doing. He's hoping that it will inspire those people, the people who are a little more homophobic and who are a little bit more caught up on the issue of abortion. As in their electoral politics.
Interesting. So it just seems kind of like more of this, like we saw in the Carmona race, this last-minute mudslinging before the actual election. So
exactly.
But, wow. Well, that's interesting. We'll see what happens. So I guess the last thing that we kind of wanted to talk about was something we touched on last week as well, which is this whole idea of, like, militarizing the border and the consequences of doing that.
So there's been another border killing this week, and this time the victim is a young Mexican man. Who is shot 7 times.
Shot 7 times on the Mexican
side.
On Mexican soil. Mm-hmm. So we have American law enforcement officers killing people in another country.
Exactly. And this happened this was in Nogales, or on the Mexican side. And let's see a little bit about him. 16-year-old Mexican boy.
And this is not the first time. I swear, I remember there was an incident that was caught on video, right? Mm-hmm. Remember that one?
Well, it was a beating, right?
Cell phone video, I think, of another young man. So, and they're usually young men, as you pointed out, and they're throwing rocks, which is not smart. It's not smart.
No, not at all. But I mean, it gets back to excessive force. It's like, do you combat or do you engage with somebody who's throwing rocks with firearms? Is that what you do? So
yeah. So, but and again, like the broader scheme of things, as we were talking about last week, and I think we could talk about literally all day long, is when we're talking about what's essentially civilian law enforcement. Do we want to characterize it as a war? Mm-hmm. Do we want it to be a militarized border? Because as we've seen between last week and this week, both sides lose. You have Border Patrol agents who get killed. And you have, Mexican nationals getting killed over, nobody can really, what are we really fighting?
Well, this one was, I think they said in this case it had to do, there was, it was a drug incident. Mm-hmm. But what is not apparent is whether the guy that was killed was really involved in that. Yeah. So, there's a lot of collateral damage, obviously, with the drug war.
But anyways, so that's our show this week. Please, again, like this video, share it, tweet it, subscribe to our channel, leave us comments. You can tweet us.
Yeah, tweet us. I'm at Latino Politics.
I'm Sara Chica D. And, we can't wait to hear from you and let us know. And if you want to be on our show, like I said, tweet us, email us, and hopefully we'll see you back next week.
Yeah, we'd love to interview you.
Definitely. Bye.
Bye.